can you let us know when we're live?
You're live, everybody.
Okay, perfect. So for everyone who is listening, welcome to the first ever panel discussion hosted by Hypocrite Reader, hosted in conjunction with the publication of our 95th issue, Symptoms. And we're live now. Okay, so we're very happy to invite a number of writers and friends of the magazine to discuss with us today topics related to collective bodies and how one can do politics in and through collective bodies. So before we dive into questions, I would like to introduce our panelists today. So first, we have Sando Sinai, who is a composer, writer, performer, teacher, and communist living in Brooklyn, New York. She loves the bass guitar, her cat Wendy Carlos, and unitary theory. Next, we have Mary Beth Ruther Wu, who earned her PhD in medieval studies from Cornell University in 2017, where she defended her dissertation, Revel, Raving and Outlawry, Regulating the Body Politic in Late Medieval Popular Literature. She recently contributed an article on blood feud and ballads in the forthcoming book, Food and Feast in Pre-Modern Outlaw Tales, So Shall We Take Our Dinner Sweet When the Greenwood Consumes the Outlaw. Next, we have Alexander Walls, who is an Australian writer and history researcher based in Berlin. His interests include Central Europe memory, culture, and the literature of dissent, and Wales. He is currently working on a series of essays about chronic illness. And last but not least, we have Zoe Balinsky, who is a writer, educator, poet, philosopher, and Jewishly motivated anarcho-communist. She has a master's degree in philosophy from Villanova University and is currently pursuing a career in Jewish education. Her work theorizes the relationship between economic forces and the body and theorizes the practice of building communism from the body outward. So just from our introductions, it seems like we'll have a lot to talk about. But I would like to open with a quote that was suggested by Zoe in the course of our introductory discussions. And this is a quote by Anton Gramsci. The modern prince, the myth prince, cannot be a real person, a concrete individual. It can only be an organism, a complex element of society in which the cementing of a collective will, recognized and partially asserted in action, has already begun. This organism is already provided by historical development, and it is the political party, the first cell containing the germs of collective will, which are striving to become universal and total. So with that quote in mind as sort of an opening, I think I'd like to begin by asking, what do we mean when we call the state a body or a community a body, and when we treat individuals as symptomatic of a whole?
I'm happy to begin since
Sure,
I'm
please.
historically the earliest. I think that the answer for a medievalist is different, which is why I think it's a good launching point, because humoral medicine means that you define the body differently.
Mhm.
So if the body is defined not by its, outward limits and its antagonism with, outside invaders, instead, you think of it in terms of the relationships that it has with its environment, the regimen of intake and excrement, and however else you get things out of the body. And so I think of the medieval collective body similarly in terms of a set of rituals and collective practices that they would engage in together in order to try and encourage the sense that the state, or even on a smaller scale, something like just one monastery, was all operating together in service of a single goal, whether that's praising God or keeping the state intact. And I think that kind of leads in, interestingly, to Alex's definitions of the social body. Talking about that. You don't mind me bouncing it?
No, sure. Yeah, that's very interesting. I think as far as my essay is concerned, and it's focused more on I think mostly focused on the turn of the 20th century and a bit of the late 20th century. I see the society as organism or economy as organism phraseology coming up seems to be something that goes hand in hand with sort of productivity obsessions, fetish, and fears about unproductive members of society, whether that's the chronically ill or folks with sort of sexualities that are deemed, that sort of like have fatigue and pain and these sort of medical schemes of weakness weaponized against them in a way. So I think there's a very strong disciplining function to the idea of a collective body, whether that means lopping off the useless bits or the supposedly toxic bits, or whether that's a matter of mobilizing the workforce of people within this collective body to be more productive. I think there's a sort of existential panic about it almost on behalf of the collective that can end up having certain internal and external violences. I think that's what I was trying to explore in my essay.
I can kind of bounce into that, because I think a lot of, in my essay, a lot of how I sort of theorize the collective bodies in terms of how it does things, right? It's not a collective body, in my essay at least, it's not a collective body meaningfully until it is able to exert some kind of collective will on the world. And I think how you sort of imagine that then really sort of problematizes that, right? In a way, and especially the time period you're talking about. I think ultimately where I inherit a lot of that, or at least some of that, is from phenomenology. Which of course is famously sort of taken up in Heidegger, who also was a Nazi, and I think of it. So I think of it very much in this way of being able to exert some kind of will. But I find some version of it necessary because, actually I talk about this in a passage that I cut out of the essay, that I think Kit remembers, is part of why it's necessary for me is, it's necessary to have these sort of proletarian collective bodies, right? These working class collective bodies doing some sort of class consciousness in whatever Marx or Lenin sense you want to take that, because the state is doing it, right? The state is really good at being a collective body in all of the ways that you described, right? It is so able to have these organs that exert the will of the state, as we see now in sort of the police repression in places like Portland and Chicago, and I think that there is a real problem in kind of reconciling the collective proletarian body with these ways that the collective body can be problematic. And I actually think that bounces very well over to Zoe, because for me, a big part of that is having these collective bodies be oriented around care and mutual aid and protection, and sort of having these collective bodies to protect and uplift the sort of most vulnerable members of society. rather than sort of cast them off because they're not useful to the body. And I think that goes well with what Zoe has been talking and writing about. So I'll hand that off.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Sorry, I was on mute. I have a lot of thoughts. I wanted to get to the question of like why this existential paranoia that Alexander was speaking to. And I also wanted to talk a little bit about the periodicity and the difference between a humoral medicinal approach versus a modern biological approach, because I think so much of modern biology is founded on metaphors of warfare and invasion and, you know, immune responses being like first line of defense, you know, these kinds of metaphors. And I don't think metaphors are secondary in these conversations. And so what we're talking about here about collective bodies is not just a metaphor. I think it's actually very powerful political rationality that is tied to it. And so I think, you know, that existential paranoia that comes with the state comes with this biological understanding of the state as a literal body, and literal bodies are vulnerable. They're open to invasion. They're open to, you know, quote unquote, foreign bodies, you know, establishing themselves within the political body and unsettling it from within. So I think the vulnerability of the biology metaphor that goes with it, I think is really central here to how, and the assumption of universal warfare. I mean, if we're going with biology, we're going with Darwin. Darwin got his term, the struggle for existence from Malthus, whose struggle for existence was a social and political struggle, right? And so it's not a big leap for social Darwinists and architects of the state who take, you know, their cue from social Darwinists to reapply Darwin's theory, which he called a state of nature, to the political sphere. And then we have this issue of like different kinds of organisms coexisting or not coexisting, at war with one another, struggling to exist. And it just results in this pathologizing of certain forms of political formation that I think is really remarkable about modern statecraft in general.
I have a thought on that, if you don't mind me jumping in.
Please.
I have a quote right in front of me from the US Office on Women's Health that explains, you know, for the layman, that autoimmunity, autoimmune disease, results when special T cells, special cells called regulatory T cells, fail to do their job of keeping the immune system in line. The result is a misguided attack on your own body. And that was a jumping off point for me in one of the, some of the work that I've done, because I was so fascinated by the idea, the kind of elision of the attack and the workplace and this kind of body as machine and the kind of industrial war force. And this threat of the body constantly kind of exceeding its parameters and becoming rebellious. So that's partly what got me interested in medieval ideas about the body, because what I saw in a lot of scholarship was the implications of this kind of panning out in historians and literary scholars' work, that, you know, people would project this kind of paranoia onto historical texts, where I really didn't see them applying. You know, they didn't have the same kind of constant fear of attack and invasion. But because those are the only ways that we can think the body, then they end up being inserted into the narrative. And what's clear as a, you know, citizen rather than a historian, is that that isn't just true of medieval scholarship, right? That happens elsewhere. And if the implications for something as relatively, minor as, medieval history, then I'm sure that there are all kinds of ways that we can extrapolate the effects that these attitudes have on political organizations.
Zoe, your comment about invasion and the sorts of militaristic biological metaphors that we draw in made me think about how gender relates to these sorts of metaphors. In other words, the state is not merely theorized as a body, but specifically a masculine body whose integrity relies on the performance of warlike, traditionally masculine gender roles. This wasn't really something that anyone talked about specifically in their essays, but I'm wondering if anybody has thoughts about how gender plays into these kinds of discussions.
I touched on that a
Okay,
little
I
bit.
apologize.
I think it wasn't much. Let me actually pull up my own passage of that really quick. I touched on it because I was talking about sort of the uses of mindfulness, and yeah. So in my essay, I'm talking about mindfulness and it's. I'm rehabilitating it, but sort of looking at the way it's used and the way generally sort of the relationship between the mind and the body is considered in the mainstream. And I talk about how there's two ways that mind body dualism kind of happens in a lot of contemporary consciousness, and one of them is the way where you want to have dominion over your body, right? You want to have sovereign dominion over your body. My mind rules my body. I can do whatever I want. Alex talks about this too, as sort of the athlete mindset, right? Where it's like, yeah, I don't care how tired I am. I can keep doing this athletic task. I can stay up late and accomplish this task and never get any sleep and do a lot of stimulants. And the other mode of it is sort of the wellness of wanting to sort of get this sort of presumed, or this, it's nominally a holistic unity between the mind and the body. It's nominally like my mind and my body are integrated, and I love my body in all these ways, and that's how I can be productive and do all this yoga and I think there's very much a gendered line to that, right? There's a really obvious gendered line to that, and I don't remember. I think I hinted at this. I didn't really make it explicit. Is that as I talk about this sort of in political functioning, I talk about I sort of think of, as far as wanting to sort of control the body, right? To think of sort of a lot of the sort of Stalinist parties, right? And those kinds of political organizations that are trying to, we are the vanguard. We are the vanguard of the proletariat. We will lead them to revolution because they can't get there on their own. And then the flip side of that being sort of the Democratic Party and the NGO sector that's sort of focused, not just, it's focused on harm reduction, which is good, of course, but also, but harm reduction sort of made the end in of itself. That presumes like, wait, we can't heal we can't do anything about these sort of fundamental divisions of society, and it's sort of the nice wing of capital, the nominally nice wing of capital, and that really falls under gendered lines, right? There's a very gendered aspect to it that's hard to ignore.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, Alex, if you have any thoughts, because it seems like your essay addresses this from the point of view of sort of masculinity in the 19th century, particularly.
Yeah, sure. I think that's really interesting. That dynamic between like self-subjugation and self-recuperation is something that I found really interesting in Sanders' essay, and I've been thinking about a lot in terms of sort of radical potential within chronic illness communities, where self-subjugation and recuperation, like those are the axes, and that's the dynamic that you have to interplay. And so rarely does something communal or properly collective come into play. In a lot of the narratives I was looking at from the 19th century, what's particularly gendered, I think, is this fantasy of perpetual motion machines, of like peak productivity, infinite productivity, conquering of exhaustion and fatigue in general is something that's like fundamentally like male coded. I looked at, there's an insane novella by Alfred Jarry called Super Male, which is one of these late Victorian era fantasies about, so it's sort of a satire of these ideas of conquering fatigue, and the male body sort of merges with the machine in a way. And in the essay I wrote about the Bradley Cooper film Limitless, which revises a lot of the same themes in this bizarre way, that he very clearly masculinizes as he begins taking this miracle medicine that takes away his fatigue and his doubt. He cuts his hair, he stops writing fiction, he runs for Senate, he seduces all these women by mansplaining to them. So I think there is something fundamentally, like deeply male gendered, and I think a lot of the industrial imagery around productivity is, if not explicitly phallic, definitely sort of horny. So I've been feeling sort of, insofar as I'm writing from my own experience, I find it sort of an interesting position to step back, because of my disobedient body, from narratives, conventional cis male narratives around disciplining the body, and find that when you have inexplicable fatigue, for instance, conventional masculinity doesn't fit so well. I think that's a hint at the fundamental genderedness of a lot of this thinking.
I have a question from Piper that relates to it. She asked if my article explores the medieval necessity of draining boils in order to drain the corruption within. With this in mind, was menstruation considered a release of moral or ethical malaise? And boy, I have wondered this too. And I actually wrote a paper called Menstruation and Purgation, Salvation of the Communal Self in Anglo-Saxon women's communities. Because I really wanted, I went to a women's college myself, and I really wanted this to believe that collective menstruation was part of the way that women's communities could foster a sense of collective self. Unfortunately, the answer is more mixed, yes and no. Yes, menstruation was sometimes thought to allow for the release of moral kind of an ethical malaise, but that's because they believed that women's bodies encourage this kind of excessive buildup of kind of cold, wet material inside the womb, and that if it wasn't expelled regularly, then the womb would go wandering and cause insanity. So it was not the superpower that I really wanted it to be under the rubric of humoral medicine. It's really, it comes back to the idea of checks and balances, that, you know, you have an excess and a mechanism for regulating it. And it comes back to the idea of disciplining the body, to kind of bounce off of Alexander's thought there, that when you see it in the monastic context, it is programmed in with all other ways that they would try to discipline bodies to create a uniformity of bodily experience. So that includes when you go to sleep, when you wake up, when you change your clothes, when you change your shoes, when you wash your feet was a big one, and when you go to the bathroom. But what's funny is that male communities were equally anxious about bathroom breaks. And you could only, you know, use the facilities at the same time all together. They had more urinals per monk in some monasteries than we have toilets per person in luxury hotels. Which is, you know, a funny fact for people to think the Middle Ages were really dirty. So menstruation became kind of part of that overall regimen, where you have to control when your body is releasing things, when your body is taking things in, so that everybody is totally in sync with one another, whether you're male or female, it doesn't really matter. It's all part of this kind of ideal and imaginary desire for balance, like perfect balance. So, yeah. Anyone to jump off that?
I actually, I think that's very interesting in terms, in relationship to one of the articles in Hypocrite from none of us present here, from Nastya Panichkina's article, Are You There, Follicle, which is about this really, really bizarre period tracking subculture where, like, every day at the same time, every day you have to check your temperature and your vaginal secretion viscosity and your, like, cervical rigidity. You have to check it, like, at the same time every day to track when you're ovulating, so you know to wear the correct color of sex clothes so you can have the sex so you can reproduce. And I think that's really, that's really especially interesting to me, because I think in a lot of how we're discussing this, it's in terms of, you know, the production of bodies, right? The production of bodies, and I think we could move into sort of a sense of reproduction. And this is a question that I sort of grapple with a little bit, or I don't grapple with in my essay, but that I'm thinking about it. It feels like something I want to address is reproducing, not just sort of seeing this kind of whatever consciousness or body awareness of and what have you, not just sort of seeing it emerge, but seeing it reproduce, right? Seeing it sort of spread and continue. And I don't have a real thought there, but just to say sort of that it's something I'm thinking about, that I'd like a better answer to than I have.
I can speak to that a bit.
Please.
So I wanted to speak to the gender issue and how gender relates to like the body politic conceived of as a literal body. And I think menstruation and pregnancy both play into that, because I think that you know, my work revolves around Hobbes, and Hobbes divides the body politic in half into bodies acting in their natural capacities and bodies acting in their political capacities. And it's similar to a basic liberal public-private distinction, where the public is implicitly gendered as male and the private is gendered as female. So the bodies acting in their natural capacities would be like not only eating and drinking and excrement, but also procreating, menstruation, things like that. These are bodies acting in their natural capacities. And so the reason the body politic is revealed to be implicitly gendered as male is because it cannot unambiguously incorporate, with the emphasis on the corpus Latin root of incorporate, like in make part of the body. It can't unambiguously do that with bodies who bring their natural capacities with them into the workforce. And so that will always be seen by employers as a cost on production. Women's embodiment, disabled people's embodiment. You know, if you have a stomach ache and you're able-bodied, you're expected to sort of clock it in at the door and ignore it, you know, grin and bear it. But if you're disabled, you bring your disablement into the workplace with you. And so there's no unambiguous separation of natural and political. And so sorry, Sando's comment threw me off.
No, me too.
That divide between natural and political doesn't really hold up for certain members of the body politic, including women, cisgender women, but also trans women, people who menstruate, people who can get pregnant, and then also disabled people in a large respect. And so they're always going to be seen as a sort of drag on the productive forces of society, because they cannot be unambiguously workers. You know, they can't just put aside all their embodied concerns at the door and take care of business at work. You know, this is not to say that like there's anything natural about women or disabled people's oppression. You know, that when I use natural, I'm saying it's also a political construction, just as the political is for Hobbes. And so I don't think you can like project those gender norms onto any kind of gendered ontology or realness to gender. I'm saying that what is constructed as natural capacities is always going to be implicitly gendered as female, and that is part of the gendering of the body politic that makes it so masculine. And also this phrase from Hobbes, these postures of war that the body politic takes on towards anything that doesn't fit into the body politic, is a very masculinized, you know, the notion of warfare as the condition for society is a very masculine approach. And I in my work propose an alternative ontology of care, of gestures of care and caregiving, which is rooted in feminist scholarship. Yeah.
I think, Zoe, your comment sort of ties into a consideration of where the individual fits into the collective body, particularly like how collective bodies deal with difference. So I'm wondering if any of you can speak to this idea of what is at stake for, I guess, different elements who might represent vis-a-vis the state a threat to the integrity of the collective body.
I can speak to that briefly, very briefly. just to follow up, I think what's at stake for the state is political death. I mean, that's how Hobbes defines sedition, which is anything that divides sovereignty. And so a divided sovereignty like we have in the United States, which has nominally three different branches of government, that would not be a sovereign for Hobbes, because it's got checks and balances, and it's not a pure sovereignty which is undivided. And so the body politic has this paranoia about dividing sovereignty, about different. And so how does it deal with difference? I think it deals with it with genocide. I think that is the primary, or eugenics, or something that includes genes in it, like something horrible like that, fascism, like I think difference is always to be either disciplined or cut out. And so you either get biopolitics or necropolitics, to use Akeem Mbembe's term. So yeah, that's what I think. I think really political difference in particular, is always considered to be a hostile threat and is treated with paranoia. And that's what's at stake for the state.
I have an answer that I think takes us in a slightly different direction. We talked about in our chat earlier that one of the things that this reminds me of is, obviously I have been discussing over and over again the way that medieval communal regimens could try to institute kind of uniformity. So I don't want to try and imagine this as some sort of utopian alternative to our own models. But one thing that I am interested in medieval models is the role of like carnival and revel, where you have kind of ritual forms of putting political, social, gendered difference forward and to the forefront of society for these, long festivals. Like, it's not just 1 minute, one event. It's, sometimes these week-long parades and celebrations where you have men dressed as women and women dressed as men, and apprentices who are ruling over their masters, and, on a kind of, topsy-turvy society that Disney made so famous with their terrible song. So one way that a lot of scholars talk about carnival, kind of following Bakhtin, is the idea that it is a pressure valve or safety valve for any kind of dissonance within a society, any kind of disagreement or class tension. It can be expressed safely within the parameters of these revels and kind of bled off without doing, revolutionary harm eventually. And my rage as a medievalist at seeing this industrial imagery constantly populating discussions of medieval carnivals, the safety valves and the pressure valves and all of these, boilers popping up in the middle of a, 13th century parade. And that led me to where I got to with, bursting boils, bursting pustules. This is the way that they would have envisioned releasing pressure. And in fact, their texts show that they did. And one of the interesting kind of side effects of thinking about it in terms of here's an infection that I'm going to burst and, get the poison out, let the poison run out of this, wound, all of this dissonance, all of this anger. But you have authors like Chaucer who notice, wait a second, now the infected stuff is everywhere. So there's a lot of tension there with the idea of revel, that the kind of pressure valve metaphor doesn't let you see, but there you can express anxiety about, okay, maybe this type of ritual allows us to express some of this pressure. And on the other hand, you have people saying, what if we express too much pressure and it bursts everywhere and everyone gets infected with the desire to embody the power of someone of a higher class, of a different gender, and you can't uninfect them of that. And so there's a very real danger then that and tension in expressing these differences that makes it kind of more exciting.
I think that's really, if I can jump in, I think that's really interesting to look at that sort of next to how people view the riots, right? How people view riots, and of course, the state and the right wing and all that is always trying to say, this is just bad. We have to crack down on this. We have to suppress it. We have to regulate it. In all the ways it does that. But then there's a certain left-wing narrative that comes up that is, these people are letting off steam. These people are letting off steam. They're blowing off steam. They're letting it out, and I think there's a lot of danger in that. There's a lot of danger in that because it is still afraid of the pus getting everywhere, right? Whereas, what if the pus gets everywhere and that's a good thing, right? I'm working on another article right now. Completely different stuff. Much more of me actually doing something resembling musicology, and it's about Les Mis, and when they had like Blackout Tuesday or whatever, right after the George Floyd uprising started, the Les Mis, the musical official Facebook page, like posted in support of Black Lives Matter, and people were really mad. People were like really, really mad. Like Les Mis fans were coming into the comments and saying, it's one thing if you want to stand on a corner and hold a sign and sing, but if we're having property destruction, then we need Javert. We need they always really want to fall back on the military the sort of regulatory function of the state right as soon as the pus is going to get on them, right as soon as it's like, oh wait, I'm going to be infected, right? That's immediately when it's sort of revealed to be, you don't just think you think they're blowing off steam maybe, and you think that's fine as long as it doesn't get anywhere near you. And I think that points to something that I think about, something that I really had in mind in my essay is not just, beyond the problem of what is the right answer, right? What is the right way to think about the body, and the right way to think about, and to extrapolate, what is the right way to think about fatigue? What is the right way to think about pustules and pressure valves and whatever metaphor we're doing. But beyond that, like, once we have the sort of the right way to think about it, or the way to think about it with the most liberatory potential, how do you get people on board? How do you sort of work through the sort of structural psychology that maintains, because the problem of regulatory conceptions of political bodies isn't just that everyone is buying into regulation. It's that it's really, really hard not to buy into that, even when you're trying as hard as you can, even when you're doing the best job you can to sort of not fall into these traps, not fall into these metaphors, that these sort of problematic metaphors. Sometimes you do it anyway. And I'm very interested in trying to work through and past that.
Sando, I'm wondering if you're just dovetailing on that, if your decision to sort of avoid these kinds of metaphors in your essay was a conscious choice arising from precisely the kinds of concerns about these metaphors that you just raised.
Not consciously. I think maybe some of it is me being bad at poetry a little bit, right? I do think I was talking to Zoe about this yesterday. I do think that rather than going towards biology metaphors, or I do think that rather than going for biology metaphors or physical sort of machinistic metaphors, I think I go towards something more topological about sort of the sort of abstract shape of thought, and sort of looking for certain kinds of, I guess, invariants. And I also think that I do a lot more simile than metaphor a little bit. And I think that it's sort of defining, how I'm selling my essay whenever I share it on social media is it's about being at a protest and knowing that the thing everyone should be doing, but they're not doing it, and being in a practice room and you're practicing the drums when you have a tic disorder, are feel like the same thing. And so I'm building more of a simile than a metaphor. And part of that, the distinction between those, I think, comes in intentionality of the structure in a certain way, and a desire to have the comparison, to have the image, but for the image not to get out of hand, for the image not to start justifying itself without me justifying it. Does that make sense? That's a little abstract, but I think that's sort of where my sort of lack of metaphor comes from a little bit.
Okay. We have a question from one of our viewers. Someone asks, speakers, do you agree with thinkers like Foucault and Nietzsche who posit that the ultimate target of social policy and the foremost focus of power is the human body. Does anybody have thoughts on that?
I do. I am happy to get us started off. I very much agree with this. A lot of my work has been grounded in biopolitics and thinking about how the state acts on the body. And one of the things that I come back to a lot is the fact that in the early history of the common law, the law that we use in basically any country that was a colony of the United Kingdom uses common law. The major form of proof used to be bodily trials, things like holding a hot pipe and seeing if your hands burned. Surprise, they did. Or doing judicial battle, physically hitting one another, and then whoever survives, God says you're right. Well, Pope said, no more bodily trials, you're testing God. And so in the 12th century, you see a kind of scramble within the common law to come up with alternative forms of proof that don't involve these physical trials. And one of the answers was the jury system, which today a lot of people turn to as this kind of humanitarian cornerstone of democracy, but was really originally envisioned as an alternative form of harm, right? This is another way that we can act on the body of the political subject without physically forcing them to hold a burning pipe, and mark them in certain ways to reincorporate them as kind of a docile subject of the law. And the way that it operated partly was because original juries were not impartial, right? It was not envisioned as 12 people who have never heard about this before, the way that people do today. They were kind of gossip bodies. You would get the 12 biggest busybodies in the community, and they would come and present their knowledge of this person within the community to judges who traveled on a circuit and didn't have any knowledge of the community. And so the explicit goal there was to levy all of the harmful gossip that you had on this person in front of the judge in order to basically test their character. And so this to me is kind of symptomatic of the way that we have mechanisms of law, we have mechanisms of order that people really don't think of today as being bodily or embodied, but really have their origins in medieval processes that were intensely bodied. And so those remnants are still there, at the core of our law, and still doing harm, like they were designed to do. So yes.
Are there any other thoughts on this question?
Oh, I think Alexander, you're on mute.
Am I on mute now? Bloody oldie over here. Okay. I think there's something interesting there as well with temporality in terms of just in my essay, I was thinking a lot about labor and the body. And I think, I'm not sure what it adds up to, but I think it's important to think about historical thinkers of the body in terms of the way bodies interacted with society in those times. And certainly someone like Nietzsche is writing at a time when labor, for instance, was eminently physical and very publicly physical. And so the disciplining of the human body within the workplace had a different sort of resonance than it would have been in the era when Foucault was writing, and certainly now. So I think the sense of the body and what it means is always going to be historical within these thinkers, and I think you see it with older Marxists and more recent Marxists as well. The image of labor in society at the time and very real economic conditions impact the way the body relates to power and the ambitions that social policy has with respect to the body. Don't know what that adds up to.
I think it's really interesting. I think I think you're sort of right to point out that it's making a comeback, right? It's making a comeback. You know, I mean, one obvious sort of facet is sort of talking about labor around, with coronavirus, with first, so many people are unemployed all of a sudden, and have nothing but their houses and their bodies, like in a certain way, right? And both of those are precarious. And then also, I think of recent thought about sex work, right? And even stuff that I would say isn't recent, but maybe some people on the left are listening to sex workers about it now, instead of moralizing it. And even I could think of like a couple of Twitter personalities, who are sex workers, who recently have been like, if you send me your receipt of donating to this bail fund, I will send you nudes. Right? And that is that of course starts from labor, and is such this like perfect example of politicizing the body, and politicizing the body, or exposing the body that was already political, but naming it as such.
Mm. Zoe, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I want to say I'm basically in agreement with Foucault here, which means I'm basically in agreement with Nietzsche, because, you know, that famous line from Foucault when asked what kind of philosopher he was, and he responded late in life, he said, "I'm a Nietzschean." And I think that's true, you know. So I think we do have to credit Nietzsche for giving us Foucault in some sense. Um, Also Althusser, because Foucault was his student, but other than that, you know, a couple other names came up in the questions from the YouTube channel, including Hortense Spillers and Akeem Mebe. And I think, you know, all these different frameworks for approaching the body are really important. Another big one is Merleau-Ponty, who also uses the term flesh along with Hortense Spillers, but in different ways. You know, I think all these conceptions of the body are valuable. And when I use the term body, I'm referring to pretty much the body as a sort of assemblage of different aspects: phenomenological, experiential, material, and anatomy, you know, social, gendered. You know, there's all these different components that go into making a body, and a body is really a projected construction. You know, another thinker of the body that I draw from is like Gail Solomon, who was Judith Butler's student, who does a lot of phenomenological work with like the bodily ego and how that is constructed both psychoanalytically and phenomenologically. And so, you know, you can drop all these names and it's not super important. What it matters is when we're talking about the body, we're talking about an assemblage of political forces and political force. So the body itself is a force. It is also acted upon by forces outside of it. So that's my take I think Nietzsche is right that despite being a huge racist and an anti-Semite and a bunch of other problems with Nietzsche, sexist, he's basically right about how the body is the central locus of force, and how and I think that's becoming more and more apparent as we enter a more embodied era of politics, with mass protests and police repression. The body is once again at center stage, and I think there are reasons for that.
You referenced a question that we received from one of the viewers, and I just wanted to share it in case anybody else had thoughts. It's a bit long, but so it's a question concerning bodies. In the work of Horstense Spillers and those inspired by her, body is counterposed to flesh, as the former is a juridical category / related to formal legitimacy, whereas activists referring to trans bodies or Black bodies seem to be using the term closer to Akil Mbembe's politics of viscerality, the body as a shorthand for the immediacy of experience, and in juxtaposition to the state. Which registers have you found more useful, and why? So Zoe was sort of drawing upon this question, and in her response, I'm wondering if anybody else has responses to this as well.
I find the idea of the shorthand for the immediacy of experience. I think I would sort of align with that, but with the idea that a shorthand is never really a shorthand, right? It's always its own thing. It always brings something. And it's always, and again, I think over in the chat, which I'm checking on a little bit, there's a question of what is an assemblage, asking to Zoe, and as I understand it in this context, it sort of refers to, you have all of these aspects of it which all sort of constitute the body and are all so complex by themselves as to have all of these problems in conceptualization, to bring all of these things you have to deal with. And then when you take all of them and say, even to the extent that they might contradict each other, they're all there at the same time, and that sort of makes up the assemblage, right? It's all of these aspects to what sort of constitutes the body are all true in a way, and when they are inconsistent, then the places that they contradict each other sort of tend to dialectically, in a way, that's a buzzword, but tend to dialectically reveal the contradictions of the society that produces these different ideas, these different theories of the body, and so to answer, I think, specifically about Spillers and Mbembe's conceptions, I think I guess sort of bouncing, starting more with Mbembe. When people talk about trans bodies, Black bodies, there is there's a sense of so you know it's shorthand for what is immediate, and to sort of make immediate in the imagination like the violence inflicted on these bodies, because it is of course always or almost always sort of talking about the violence inflicted on these bodies by the state, by capital, by medical institutions and what have you. It's not just the short. It's not just shorthand for the immediacy of experience. Then it's it's almost the inverse of that to me, right? Where it's the I don't know. I don't think I'm articulating this particularly well, but when I talk about my trans body, I think the big question is that transness something my body does or something that is done to it?
Mm.
And I think that's what I'm trying to get at. I was struggling to get there, but I think that's what I'm trying to get to, right? When I talk about my trans body, is it something my body does or something that is done to it? And there is I mean it's again, it's an assemblage, it's both. And so the question is, so intuitively, you know, if I think of it as both, then it's how can it be both at the same time? How can it be something my body does and something that is done to it at the same time? And the answer to that is, I think, sort of recalls some of our earlier discussion about difference, right? It's how does my difference work within or work sort of against class society, and how does my working against class society in a way inform my difference or undercut my difference? Does that I think that almost coheres. I'm gonna let someone else jump in and say what I'm trying to say better.
So I had some thoughts about bodies as assemblages, and both is trans, when you say a trans body, is that body determined by transness, or is the body determining transness?
Mm.
And I think Sando's right, it has to be both. And it gets back to my point that bodies are both forces and conglomerates of social forces. They're both being acted upon and acting on the world. And I think, you know, it gets back to how can it be both? You know, if you look at something like W.E. Du Bois' dual consciousness, for example, you're seeing yourself as you see you, and then you're also seeing yourself as the other sees you. And in W.B. Du Bois' case, you know, it would be a Black person experiencing the racial gaze of the white other, you know, and so that is one way in which a body can be composed of multiple viewpoints, multiple perspectives. I don't know, I like to think of bodies as tectonic plates, you know, like they're in friction with one another constantly, and they're constantly in motion. And on a long enough time scale, they're fluid, right? So bodies are fluid on a long enough time scale. You just have to zoom back. They appear static like mountains and lakes and all these things which are not static, but are actually constantly in motion. And it's friction with other bodies, with other tectonic plates that cause the surface features, but there's deep, deep intercontinental forces that are pushing those bodies in different directions and causing the friction, which we only see the surface results of. We don't see the deep magma and how it's affecting the surface. So that way, bodies can both be acting and acted upon. They can, you know, be worn down via weathering. They can be built up into mountain ranges, but they, you know, they're both agents and objects of the system which they're in. And I think it gets to Sandow's point about it being a contradiction, about it being a dialectic, right? So this is Merleau-Ponty's point about the organism and its environment, that there's a dialectical relationship between them. And that dialectics is also an epistemology, because you know your environment by behaving within it, and you also change the environment based on what you know to be more in line with what you know, with what you can do in the world. And so I think the body is a dialectical relationship between the organism and the environment, which is mutually constituting the environment and being constituted by it. Acting on it and being acted on by it. And I think, you know, for example, to throw another name out, like a Spinozan conception of the body would be equally fruitful here. You know, thinking of the body as a kind of system of forces, you know, with no singular identity, but rather a collection of different aspects of force really. Yeah.
This talk of dialectic makes me think of Sandow's essay, specifically in terms of its form. I think I know we talked about earlier between the three of us a bit about how, like, what the role of autobiography or self-writing as a practice might have in terms of reconciling this sort of constructedness and selfhood and all of that kind of thing. Sandow, was that something you were thinking about consciously when you were writing? There was sort of a dialectic approach, or?
Well, that's interesting, because I used to be really into sort of doing autobiographical art and sort of in music and poetry, and then I sort of learned this sort of critique of it. I was like, I have to get away from autobiography, because no one cares about me. I have to talk about, like, everyone else in the world but me, and I have to talk about sort of the sum total of these verses. But I think you're right to sort of look for use. To look for the use of autobiography here. And actually, I'm about to knock out a bunch of birds here, because I'm also going to address a little bit of the Nietzsche question and the Hortense Spillers question, because I think, you know, to think of these sort of individual narratives, so Zoe said in the chat, in our Zoom chat, not autobiography, phenomenology. I think I'm very much here for that. So I was gonna say, with sort of looking at these individual narratives, I'm really inclined to to look at Afro-pessimism, right? Which is sort of tied, of course, to Spillers and those inspired by her. And in particular, there was an article I read a couple years ago by I think Krista Davis Akampora, who throws Nietzsche at Frederick Douglass's narrative, right? So Frederick Douglass's autobiography, sort of narrative of the life of a slave, and within that there is this very individual current, right? And there's this individual and this individualist current, right? Where it's I'm self-reliant. I'm sort of the transcendentalist. Emerson, Thoreau. I am bringing myself up out of my wretchedness. I'm teaching myself to read and so on. And of course, that's easily recuperated into liberalism, as they've done with Frederick Douglass forever. But I think there's more. There's something there also worth sticking with. And something that one way that I sort of see this come up in Afro-pessimist thought and sort of stuff influenced by that is, or specifically in art and aesthetics and sort of I can think of some musical work inspired by that really focuses on we have to get out of here, right? We have to get out of here. It's going to take every one of us to get out of here. And we can't go back for anybody. And there's specifically there's a band, like a metal / sort of blues. They do a lot of stuff called the Zeal and Ardor, that deals with this very heavily, and that I have listened to a lot and shaped a lot of my thought about this there. And they really like to do these really these repeated refrains, kind of like a tick in a way, where it's a fixation, right? You're sort of stuck on this idea and you can't get away from it. And the idea that they can't get away from is nobody waiting on you. You better run, son. Nobody waiting on you. You better run, son. And this sort of mechanical, in the music, there's this mechanical reproduction of that idea. And it speaks to the aesthetic core of why autobiography is useful in a certain way. And I think part of why phenomenology interests me is for a lot of the same reasons that psychoanalysis interests me, because it's really useful for finding the things, the ideas, or the more than the ideas even, kind of the self-conceptions that won't quite go away no matter how much you want them to, no matter how much you try. And I say this with it, I think it's really, really important to temper phenomenology with having a really grounded analysis with Marxism, right? With having sort of a grounded understanding of how the world of things, how the society we live in is made up of things created by labor, and some sense of what the ultimate contradiction is, that doesn't come from purely sort of individual phenomenology, because I think not having that is part of Postone calls it. I think not having that, Postone calls it the foreshortened critique of capital, and all of these where you have the phenomenology to really understand how the phenomenology and the psychoanalysis to understand how thought, how the way you're thinking about it works, but grounding it. But if you don't ground it with materialism, what you end up you end up with foreshortened critique of capital, with socialism of fools. You end up with Heidegger being a phenomenologist and then being a Nazi about it.
I want to wind down this conversation by asking about mutual aid and protection, which both Sando and Zoe mentioned. So just to sort of close out, I'm wondering what sort of thoughts each of you might have about how we can create radical, revolutionary collective bodies in opposition to the collective body of the state.
Can you just repeat the last bit?
Sure, my apologies. So I was basically asking how we can use mutual aid and protection, which you mentioned, to constitute radical collective bodies in opposition to the repressive collective bodies of the state.
I am happy to start. I don't think that, I mean, I'm not an expert in modern social movements in the same way as a lot of the people here are. But one of the things I've thought a lot about is communities of resistance historically.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the phenomenons that I think becomes incredibly important within communities of resistance are shared rituals and this kind of acknowledgement of shared culture and creating a kind of collective sense of self that revolves around things like music and food and art, and supplanting the kinds of rituals and the kinds of mechanisms that the state puts in place in order to kind of collectivize the body with an alternative, and one that can kind of protect and insulate people from harmful structures, right? Harmful words, or harmful language, harmful cultural practices. And that's something you see, for example, in outlaw communities that thrived along the Anglo-Scottish borders for centuries. They have this huge body of music and song that they shared and passed down over centuries that kind of reiterated the acts of their ancestors and allowed them to really maintain this incredible stance of resistance against both, the Scottish and the English sovereigns, who are pressing in and constantly waging war on both sides, right? So I think that that really speaks to the power that collective artistic practices can have in terms of supporting a community.
And Alex, I wonder if to this point we might bring in your discussion of fatigue as a site of political resistance. Do you have anything that you'd care to share about that?
Yeah, sure. I think I'm ambivalent the whole time about fatigue as a site of resistance. I think there's something interesting about fatigued bodies that puts a spanner in the works, is maybe revealing in a way of dominant discourses around the body, but it's hard to embrace it as a site of resistance, even of pride in a way that you would with other sort of alternative categories or other senses of the body, above all because fatigued people hate it and want to get rid of it. And that's hardly a point of resistance if it's something you're continually struggling against to a degree. So I think there's an ambivalence there, but I think there's something about the public making of fatigue. There's something among chronic illness and especially chronic fatigue communities that experiments with new languages of accepting bodily difference and sort of taking them as a given and trying to meet each other on different terms that familiar to all kinds of different communities. But for me personally, as a formerly sporty cis white dude, I'm embarrassingly unaccustomed to. So for me, it's more of a personal experience in trying to learn about these other ways of relating to people and doing so publicly. And perhaps if there's something radical about people who suffer from chronic fatigue, it's less the sufferers themselves and more the people that care for us without being able to see into our bodies or explain them.
Do you mind if I jump back in with a plug
Please.
For medieval literature? It reminds me really strongly what you're talking about in terms of, finding a recuperative quality in fatigue. There's an entire genre of medieval literature called dream vision. We really don't have today, and it involves usually a guy who falls asleep outside, often in May, and has these visions of personified figures or fairies or something that is meant to impart a lesson. And one particularly popular dream vision, which actually I mentioned it in my article, it became a kind of rallying cry for revolutionaries during the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, is about a guy named Will, as in to have will, the force of will over your body, who falls asleep and has a vision of all of these different figures kind of internally, like the soul, the mind, truth, sloth, sin, right? And kind of struggles with and debates with them and tries to come to terms with them. And it has this really wonderful effect of having a kind of recuperative quality to sleep. I have a tattoo actually of the final line of the poem. It says, "Till I began to wake up." And the poem just ends with him waking up because it takes place over the course of him constantly falling asleep and waking up. And the only time that the story moves forward is when he falls asleep, right? That sleep allows him to dream, and dream allows him to innovate and to think and to test his thoughts and beliefs against challenges within himself, and to transform over time. And I think it's a really beautiful way of thinking about whether or not you have, force of will over fatigue. And it's something that, the poet himself struggles with. There's an autobiographical section where he bemoans the fact that he spends so much of his life asleep, and he's afraid that he's a lazy layabout. And one of his interlocutors says, "No, you're creating art, right? You're creating poetry. This means something, right? This changes the world." And I think that that's something that maybe might be useful to bring into the modern world, kind of appreciation of a lost medieval genre.
Very cool. Are there any other sort of final thoughts, or will we end with medieval dream visions? If not, I would like to thank everyone who has tuned in for our live stream and give an especial hearty thanks to all of our panelists. It has been my sincere pleasure conversing with you all, and I'm sure that there are a lot of questions that are unanswered, but I suppose the purpose of this dialogue was not merely to answer questions, but also to raise them. And to that point, I think it was a very successful conversation. So thank you all very much. And I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of your day. And if you haven't read both the wonderful writing of our panelists and of the other contributors to Hypocrite Reader, I strongly encourage you to do so. So take care, everyone. Bye-bye.